Hey everyone, welcome to LSAT Wizard's question type explanations. This is going to be a video for flaw questions, probably the most commonly discussed, toughest question for people. So out of all the people that study for LSAT and you ask what the most challenging question is, flaws tends to be at the top, and for good reason. And we're going to get into that a little bit here. Now, this video is going to be an extension of the bigger COVID relief, logical reasoning, and reading comprehension course that we are offering. I say we, it is sponsored by Ave Maria School of Law. So a special thank you to them, as none of this would have been possible without them. So thank you, Ave Maria Law. Now, this is a COVID relief course in the sense, not just that we're offering low cost and free explanations to you guys, but really we also have this GoFundMe raising money for Feeding America's COVID Relief Fund. If you at all find these videos helpful, I do kindly ask that you consider giving. You can Google LSAT Wizard GoFundMe and you'll find it. We have already raised over $10,000, which is really remarkable. And so I want to really thank everybody who has given, and thank you in advance to those who will. Now, getting into the explanations, as I said, this is part of a broader curriculum where we did have free core lessons that went into certain concepts. If you haven't checked them out, especially for this one, lesson 3, there's so much more that I go into, hours and hours and hours of video of explanations that underlie the core concepts that we go into in these question types. Some of this we already did go over a little bit, but we're really going to go into the questions. So that's what these videos are for. Now, if you haven't found those videos and don't have this outline and want to check it out, just find my YouTube channel or on lsatwizard.com, find the free content page, and you'll see all of this there. So with that, we are going to be getting into this one. As I said, the flaw questions were part of lesson 3's outline. And while we have all of these concepts, they were so important to this question. We really discussed the concept of the different fallacies. We went through 20 different fallacies, what they looked like, sounded like. We did some examples, really broke them down. And that's going to be important for flaw questions. Now, it's not the end all be all. There's a lot in flaws. And I'm going to get into that as I go down this outline and get into where we talk about flaw questions. So page 20 here. Question type, flaws. What a flaw is simply an error in reasoning. An error in reasoning means that it is invalid. Invalid means that the evidence will fall short of proving that conclusion at a 100% level. The evidence might get you 80, 90% of the way there, but it falls short. And when things fall short, we need to have the ability to say why. That ability to say why is directly what they're asking here. Now, as I went into extensively in lessons 2 and 3, there are 3 main ways to say why something is wrong. 3 methodologies that the LSAT relies upon in describing problems. There are jumps, there are fallacies, and there are overlooked options. Now, any one question, any one invalid argument could be described from all 3. I'm actually going to, you know what, just pull up here because I'm going to need it for later in this too. For the sake, I wasn't going to do too much concept, but I'll quickly just recap with a blank page here. If we have the argument, Brandon stole this cell phone, thus he is immoral. Okay, we can say this is invalid, but why? We have to be able to put words to it. So one methodology we know is by calling out a jump. Specifically, it's a jump is where they're talking about one thing over here and something else over there. We went into this in lesson 2 a ton. All the question types from lesson 2 really rely on that. We will see it at times in flaw questions, but the idea is they're talking about one thing over here, another thing over there. In this case, they're talking about stole cell phone means immoral, and that would be the jump. Notice how I have a direction to it. It's assuming if you steal a cell phone, then you are immoral. Notice it has nothing to do with Brandon. That's jumps in a nutshell. Now, fallacies are categorical types of mistakes. As I said, I went through 20 of them in the lesson. They are going to be ones that we see in these flaw questions quite often. We have to be able to name them, or when I say name them, at least make sure we understand them and identify them when they show up in an answer choice, when they show up in a stimulus. This particular fallacy would be the fallacy of using one factor as conclusive. So stealing a cell phone might be something that we intuitively think is on target with being immoral, and it is to the level of it being a factor of being immoral. Stealing a cell phone, if morality was on a scale from like 0 and plus or minus points, and if you are plus 1,000, that's like a very moral, or minus 1,000 is not, like very immoral. Stealing a cell phone would be negative points. It would put a negative value on that, no question. But a person doing something that has a negative 100, let's say, doesn't mean that that is automatically overall immoral. It doesn't mean they are immoral. It doesn't even mean that action is moral. Even if I said, therefore, his action is immoral. We don't even know. What if the stealing a cell phone was to save a life? Saving a life could be plus 1,000. So you net come out on the positive side of things. And that's what the using one factor conclusive is describing. So fallacies allow us to describe problems by naming just by naming something categorical. In this case, the one factor conclusive is the pattern in which this fallacy, this argument fits. Now, the last one is what we call overlooked options. Now, overlooked options is the most common that we see in answer choice. They test on it a lot. We really need to make sure we understand this. Some people call these the loopholes to the argument. It's what is that idea that could come up? And I've already started naming it, like it's the idea of extra evidence that would lead us away from our conclusion. For example, the idea of saving a life. It's overlooking that it could have been saving a life. Logically, what an overlooked option is something that would weaken the argument. That's really all it is, if I'm really boiling it down to that. Now, in this case, when we get overlooked options, though, rather than coming up with those specific ones, as much as we want to make sure we understand it with specific overlooked options, the problem is that there's an infinite number of overlooked options that could be coming out of any invalid argument. And so it can be difficult to pre-answer or come up with those overlooked options in your head. Now, fallacies help guide you in the sense that when you do understand the categorical problem, we can understand the categorical overlooked options that arise out of it. I've heard overlooked options in a good way be described as the symptoms that arise out of the fallacies rather than actually naming the problem itself. So when you have a problem, an overlooked option is kind of calling out a symptom of it. And that's something that would be a correct answer in many questions, but it's not the best way to actually analyze and describe that problem. So overlooked options here in a one-factor conclusive are the counterbalancing factors. For example, the idea of saving somebody's life. So the better you understand the fallacies, the better you'll understand those counterbalancing factors. Now, I'm not going to go into the fallacies through this. That's what lesson 3 was all about. What we're going to do is go into the flaw questions that really highlight it. Now, how do they highlight it? Well, before we get there, let's just go in order of this outline quick. Question stems. How do we know we have a flaw question? That's important. When you see the word flaw, that's obviously asking for a flaw. If you see error in reasoning signals that you have a flaw question, or vulnerable to criticism. This first and third are really the most common. When you see flaw and vulnerable to criticism, that's asking for a flaw question. Error in reasoning, describing an error in reasoning is the same idea. Now, falls in that family of what we call invalid, which means that we know the stimulus is wrong. So our pre-answer is going to be generally the same of what I just broke down. Now, remember, pre-answering is not a prediction. It's not necessarily a prediction. It's just gathering our thoughts before we actually go into the answers. I don't like to specifically try to predict. I just want to kind of gather my thoughts of what's going on. The better analysis you could give of what's going on, the better you'll be at whatever answer they come up with. Now, the testing is what's key to flaws. Testing is how do we break down answers? And this is something a lot of people don't even realize and never formally learn. And so I'm going to say out of this whole thing, if you are somebody that has been struggling, has been studying LSAT and is struggling on flaws, really focus on this right here, the tests. How do we test answers? Well, it depends. This is actually what makes flaws so tough. Okay, there's two things that make flaws tough. First, from a pre-answering level, I realize I'm just going to interrupt myself for a second here. The idea is that we have no correlation of which way they're going to go. In fact, the correlation is they test some very unique and specific things in flaws. That's one of the things that makes it tough. Some questions we know they're going to test jumps. Some questions we know they're going to test overlooked options or correlations with correlation cause questions. But in flaws, we don't really know. They test all of the stuff, including even the most random assortment of issues. So that makes pre-answering tough. Now, the second thing that makes flaws very tough is that we have 4 different answer choice types. What I mean by that, when you have a necessary assumption question, okay, when you have a necessary assumption question, we do the negation test because the definition of a necessary assumption is something that if it's not true would be a problem for the argument. If we negate it and it weakens the argument, that makes it correct. If you don't know that from necessary assumptions, I would definitely recommend checking out that video before we get into flaws because flaws build on that. So the idea is that necessary assumption questions, every single answer, we know we have to do that negation test. In flaws, some of your answers are going to be presented as necessary assumptions. And so for those answers, you're going to have to do that same test of the negation test, the not true version, and see if it weakens. Whereas other answers are going to be overlooked options. Now, remember, all logically an overlooked option is something that weakens. So when you see the language of fails to account for the possibility that, or overlooks the possibility that, or ignores without considering, that's describing an overlooked option. So you go after the ... and you just ask yourself, would that weaken? That's it. It really is that. Now, it's not that much more complex to say, oh yeah, it's weakened. It's just a realizing that there is a major difference between failing to account for and this language up here, which indicates that you have a necessary assumption, which is presumes or takes for granted. If you see the author assumes, presumes, or takes for granted, they are describing a necessary assumption. So you have to do the negation test as opposed to overlooked option. It's just plug it in and weaken. And remember, negation test is a weaken. You just have to negate and then weaken. That's really what it is. Just that first step of negating first. Now, third is going to be jump statements. Some answers are going to describe jumps. The author concludes blank based on blank. The author confuses blank with blank. The author infers blank from blank. Obviously, those blanks are going to be filled in. You have to recognize that they are mentioning specific words and they are trying to say that they are connecting them. We have to know what a jump is. A jump is when they're talking about this over here and talking about that over there and insinuating they're on target. So when they confuse blank with blank, we have to make sure we see. So it's for that example that I did on the Word document here, it would be the author confuses stealing with immoral. Yeah, that would be a correct answer. Okay. The author infers immoral from evidence of stealing a cell phone. I'd be okay with that. The author concludes that someone was immoral on the basis of stealing a cell phone. Great, I'm okay with that. Now notice how these ones here have structure to them. So you got to be careful when you do have that structure, because infers means this first blank has to be the conclusion and the from has to be the evidence. So if they said they inferred somebody did an illegal action from evidence about their moral position, that would be wrong. That is flipped. That's flipped. They used evidence of illegal actions to conclude about morality. So you have to make sure that you have that right. They try to trap you with that all the time. They try to trap you with these mixes here. Now, those three might even be like, okay, I'm with you, Brandon. These are a little bit challenging, but I don't see why these are so tough. Well, that's because of number 4. Number 4 is going to throw the biggest wrench in all of this. Okay, the description of fallacies. Some answers are going to use generic terminology to describe some very cookie cutter fallacies. When I use the term cookie cutter, I don't mean easy. I mean they fit a mold of particular issues. Okay, some of these cookie cutter issues are very hard to catch and are very rare. So it's not going to be easy. Okay, it's just that it fits a particular mold. So they're going to use certain generic language, and really it's going to rely on your ability to understand what that generic language is describing to best answer this question. And what really makes this even that much more challenging is that these fallacy descriptions are going to come up in the format of one of these first 3. They could say the author's taking for granted. So if I wanted to talk about one common fallacy, one of the most common fallacies is the confusing correlation with cause. So instead of just saying the author's confusing correlation with cause, they're going to say the author takes for granted that correlation is indicative of cause. So you see takes for granted, you're like, oh, necessary assumption, let me do the negation test. But you got to realize they're still using the words correlation and cause. And so really you have to ignore the necessary part of it and just the necessary assumption portion of it and just analyze, were they doing, realize, oh, they're talking about correlation cause fallacy. Was that what was going on here? And then you have to know what that fallacy is and then be able to go identify it. And sometimes it's right, sometimes it's wrong. And so that's what makes those answer choices so challenging to break down. Okay, you might have an answer choice saying correlation. It confuses correlation with cause. So it's technically describing a jump, but it's not really describing language jump. It's describing the fallacy. Okay, so with that, let's put this into action. We got a bunch of questions to do here. It's 8. Now, where are they coming from? It's the June 2007 examples. These are all the flaw questions from June 2007's LSAT. Now, if you haven't already done these, pause the video, go find the June 2007 test. If you Google June 2007 LSAT, you can find it for free on LSAT's website. You can download it, print it, go do these questions, and then come back so that the explanations make sense, because I'm going to go right into the explanations. So with this, June 2007, section 2, question 4. Where do I have it? Oh, I got it here on this. Oh, no, I got logged out. Got to log back into my Law Hub account, which if you don't have, definitely strongly encourage you to do. It's $99 to get over 70 practice tests in the official digital format. So with this, the latest, if we're reading this, the vulnerable to criticism gives it away. In this one, I'm going to try and keep these explanations as short as possible. I'm not going to fully be able to break down every single issue. Otherwise, this video would be like 4 hours long, and people know I can do that. I can spend 30 minutes on one question. So I'm going to be as clean and concise as I can be. I'm going to give an explanation for how the wrong ones are wrong. So conclusion comes first. It is clear that O's prepackaged meals really are nutritious, but the evidence is right there. It's because of bias. that is describing the fallacy of the ad hominem family of focusing on source, specifically calling out somebody's motive or bias. So when we look at the right answer, treating evidence that there's bias as evidence that it's false. It's exactly what they're doing. Now, the false, where was O's prepackaged meal really are nutritious? The false comes because they were saying originally that O's prepackaged meals are devoid of nutritional value. So saying it's clear that they are really nutritious is saying that the report is false. Okay, so we can tie this answer to the Connolly report are false, and so we get that answer. Now, when we look at B is described. I'm going to talk about each of the answers in terms of at least which one of these four formats they are: the necessary assumption, overlooked option, jump statement, or fallacy. Now, draws a conclusion based on, so this is the format of jumps because it draws a conclusion based on evidence of this. However, they're really just describing the unrepresentative sample fallacy. Unrepresentative sample is if we switched from like evidence of recent evidence shows that mothers prefer peanut butter over all other foods, snack foods. Therefore, most women prefer snack foods. So it's mothers to women. That type of jump would be what is an unrepresentative sample. So this is just not doing that. Okay. If somehow they used the Connolly report maybe to conclude overall, maybe that could be the unrepresentative, but they're attacking the Connolly reports. There's no way they're relying here on unrepresentative sample. It's not an unrepresentative sample. So just got to understand that fallacy and know that that's not what's going on. C, fails to take into account the possibility that is an overlooked option. That means that I'm going to be thinking about the rest of this in terms of whether it weakens. So if I accept the pink, would it weaken? So if O has just as much motivation to create negative publicity for D as D has negative publicity for O, they're like, look, yeah, the Connolly report has bias, but these guys they're talking about have bias too. So if Brandon wrote a slam article, Brandon's talking, smack about another LSAT program, and you're like, oh, Brandon is an LSAT tutor, so he probably just doesn't like that other LSAT program. So we can't, so that other program's good. If the other program doesn't like me, does that validate my argument? Does that weaken my argument? Like, even if I had good reason to not like them, we've gotten in fist fights before, never happened, but that would be like, that still wouldn't weaken whether what I'm saying is true or not. The whole question is, are my words true? This still is just like saying, hey, they have as much bias as the other side. It's irrelevant really to whether the statements are true or not. So fails to provide evidence that D's prepackaged meals are not more nutritious than O's are. Now, if they had said, now, what I will point out here, besides the fact that it's biased, I could say there is a secondary mistake here, okay? And that's something that we're going to get into as we move through further questions and lessons, secondary mistakes. They don't even just say that it's biased. It means that we have to undermine their idea. They're saying it's definitively false, that there is nutritious. So we can say they are failing to provide evidence about the nutrition. They don't actually tell us evidence about nutrition. So if it says fails to provide, this is getting into a description type answer, describing, fails to provide relevant evidence. Yeah, I think I would be okay with that. But what they're saying it fails to provide evidence for is D's prepackaged meals are not more nutritious than O's. This is a comparison. We have to notice the degree language that it's comparing the nutrition of D to O. Since our conclusion was at an absolute, a non-comparative level of whether O's food is nutritious, we don't care about D versus O's nutrition. Where D and O stand comparatively is irrelevant to whether O does have nutritious. So the trap of D is relative, comparative, where this stimulus is absolute. E, presumes without providing justification that would be necessary assumption language. So that means I have to take this yellow, negate it, and then see if it would weaken. Now the easy negation, I'm just going to highlight the word not and just read around it. That's the negation. So is the yellow, what I still have in yellow, would that weaken this argument? So if D's PR department would approve of the draft of a report that was hostile to D's foods, what they're trying to say is, hey, but they would be self-deprecating. Like Brandon would admit where he falls short, that still wouldn't affect whether or not my words about that other company are true, even if it might, in a way, suggest that, like, hey, I'm more truthful. Like that's the thought here, right? Like, what if he's more truthful? But even if they would have approved a report that was hostile to their own products, First off, I'm also going to point out too a language. This is saying D's PR department, which is not actually the Connerly Foods. I mean, it's commissioned by them. So is it the same? I don't even know that it's definitively on target, but even if it was on target, that they would approve it still is not actually commenting on the nutrition. Since the argument is about whether or not there's nutrition, trying to resolve the bias issue wouldn't actually support the nutritious either. So because of that secondary mistake, it still wouldn't be relevant. So that's where A is going to be the right answer, and we're going to move on. 17, vulnerable. The argument is vulnerable to which of the following objections. So instead of criticism, objections, that's your language for flaws. Now, the conclusion here is that in light of this testimony, we should, so we should make the protections of our client confidentiality our highest priority. The question is, what is the should coming from? Whenever we see should not, that's language we have to focus on. Why should we do it? And what they're saying is that there's the most significant threat. Now, let me just kind of say this. If we knew for a fact that the most significant threat faced by large institutions such as hospitals is something, then I think we can make a little bit of a jump to say that it should be the highest priority to address that. Now, whether that jump actually holds true, I'm not sure. That's one of those like LSAT common sense standard, which I talk a lot about in the curriculum of the concepts, that maybe we could do, maybe not. That most significant threat would mean that we should be making it our highest priority. That's close. And anytime it's close, I kind of just bookmark it and move on. But we have to notice, okay, that where the evidence of it being a most significant threat came from was the source of computer experts. And it just so happens that computer experts are saying that data-related issues are our biggest problem, okay? This would be like telling you that your life insurance agent is going to tell you that buying life insurance is the biggest decision you'll ever make in your life. There's bias there. You need to recognize the bias. This is different than the bias fallacy, which is them calling out bias to say that somebody's wrong. We need to recognize that bias. So this is where we have to recognize, and that's what B is saying, the argument relies on testimony of an expert who's not shown to be sufficiently broad to support the general claim. This is describing the fallacy. If we're talking about the different answer choices, this is describing the fallacy of an appeal. They are appealing to evidence of a certain source, that source may not be representative of what we want. That was the appeal fallacy. Okay, I'm going to tell you, these ad hominems that keep coming up here are not actually the most common. Correlate, we talked about the three biggest ones: correlation cause, one factor conclusive, confusing necessary with sufficient conditions. Those are the three biggest fallacies that they use on this test. But this is one that does get repeated, and I did teach it in part of that lesson. Now, if we're looking at what the incorrect answers say, the argument confuses the cause of the problem with the appropriate solution. So the argument confuses blank with blank. So the argument confuses, I'm going to highlight here, causes of a problem with is describing a jump, appropriate solutions. So we have to ask ourselves, is there a jump between causes of problems and appropriate solutions of those problems? Okay. Now, is there evidence about cause and then the solution? Is that the jump that's going on here? Now, if the biggest threat is unauthorized access, maybe you're like, the only way I could see you picking this is if you're like, okay, and remember, I try to always put myself in the mindset of where would this person be, as opposed to being totally dismissive of an answer. So the cause, the evidence was the cause, that unauthorized access is the cause of the biggest threat, and therefore they're going to a solution of addressing that. But that wouldn't be a jump, because if the biggest threat is X and we're like, so we should address X, that's not confusing the cause with the appropriate solution, okay? Because they say it generically, protecting our client's confidentiality, which is the problem, was unauthorized access. Where A could have been correct in a different example, if our biggest threat, and we know for a fact our biggest threat is X, therefore we should do Y to prevent X. That's when A might be the correct answer. So X is our biggest threat, so we should be doing Y to stop X. That's like, okay, where did you get Y from? Why? How do we know Y is the appropriate solution to solving X? That's when A would be correct. Since that's not what's happening here, it's incorrect. Okay, the author assumes that this is that necessary assumption language, but I see correlation between two phenomena as one causing the other. You have to know that's describing the correlation cause fallacy. And you have to know what that looks like. The most common version, there's a lot of variants of it. We discuss it in lesson 1 and lesson 3 and lesson 2 of our core concepts. But the idea is the most common is our statistical correlation. If I write it out here as the generic, so if I delete this, it's most people believe, people who have X are more likely to have Y than people who do not have X. Thus, X is causing Y. This would be a classic example of correlation cause, and it's the most common one, where we have this statistical correlation between X and Y. X is more likely to have Y than people who don't have X, to say that X is causing Y. That's correlation cause. Notice how what I'm doing here isn't just giving you an example, but I want to show how the language is all the same. It's like these issues are just correlated, thus cause. But the idea is this evidence would be cause. It's the biggest threat. The threat is kind of the cause. So the evidence isn't correlation, it's a cause. And we're just saying we should address it. I mean, this is definitely so far from correlation cause. If you pick that, that just means you really don't understand the fallacy of correlation cause. So you really got to focus on that, which comes back to what I said is so hard about this test. Is just making sure we understand all these fallacies. Now, this is going to be, D is again about the unrepresentative sample. Discussed that earlier in one of the other explanations of this video. That's like switching from evidence of mothers to concluding about women. The evidence here was focused on hospitals, and this is a hospital executive, so we can say that that is representative samples. Okay, it's not that saying the computer expert, that's our source. That's different than the sample of our evidence. Okay, so the source is problematic, not the sample of our evidence. The evidence was that about large institutions such as universities and hospitals. Okay, if they had said that universities and hospitals, therefore all large institutions should, that would have been an unrepresentative sample. E, it infers that a property belonging to large institutions belongs to all institutions. Okay, now they tell you about large institutions here. So sorry, let me do the descript. This is the format of inferring blank belongs to blank. That is trying to describe a jump, that they are jumping from evidence of large to concluding about all institutions. They were going from large. That part's true, the large institutions, but they're only focused on our clients, which is just their hospital. So they are not concluding about all institutions, and that makes E incorrect. All right, 21. The reasoning is vulnerable to criticism. That's language that tells you that you have flaws. Now, my friends say that I will one day, so if I go to the conclusion, trading my sports car in for a minivan would lower my risk. That is causal degree language. Doing the action of trading it in would have the effect, would trigger the response of lowering the risk of an accident. That is a correlation, okay? The evidence was just that there are low accident rates for the minivan versus sports cars, okay? This is exactly, I did this intentionally because I knew this was the next question. People with X are more likely to have Y than people who do not have X. Where is the equivalent of that? Right here in this orange statement. I have done some research. It's not even that. It's apparently minivans and large sedans have low accident rates compared to sports cars. So this group has low rates compared to that group. A statistic. They are giving you statistical analysis of two groups. The truest correlation is X versus not X. What they are comparing here is minivans versus sports cars, but the guy is switching from a sports car to a minivan in his conclusion. He's saying, I'll trade in the sports car for a minivan. So I'm okay with the X versus not X idea. It's minivans versus sports cars. Sometimes that would be an issue if they were like, if they didn't tell you that he had a sports car, or they didn't tell you he's switching from a minivan, that might be an issue. But the idea is it's not an issue of that language here. Instead, it's just that we know there are low accident rates, but this orange statement does not tell us why. There are low rates, great, but why? We don't know. It doesn't mean the minivans are the reason for it. Remember, overlooked options that arise out of correlation cause are huge. There are two in particular. Maybe it's reverse cause and effect. Okay, maybe, instead of minivans having lower accident rates lead to people getting minivans. I'm not sure that one would make sense, but I think the second common explanation to correlation cause, that's the second overlooked option that arises out of it that we need to know is very likely to be tested if they went to it. we see the answer is talking about correlation cost, but they could have easily talked about the overlooked option of underlying third factors. There's some underlying explanation as to why this person, as to why people with minivans have low accident rates. And so that's going to be the correlation cost there. Now, if we were looking at this, it relies on a sample that's too narrow. Again, they're talking about unrepresentative sample. That's actually what they're talking about in B, that it's too narrow of a sample. It's a sample that's too narrow. It would have to switch from evidence about minivans to conclude about all cars. That would have to be the type of switch. So that's not going to be B. Misinterprets evidence that inverts evidence that a result is likely as evidence that is certain. Okay, so misinterprets blank as blank is going to be describing the jump, that third type. But what they're saying is it misinterprets evidence that a result is likely as evidence that the result is certain. So they're jumping from likelihood to certainty. Okay, they do not have evidence about likely to saying certain. So that would be data shows that when people switch from sports cars to minivans, they typically lower their accident rate. Therefore, if I switch from a sports car to a minivan, I will definitely avoid my risk. That would be the type of jump, and that's just not what's happening here. So C is not describing a problem that's there. D is describing the sufficient and necessary. Sufficient and necessary condition, remember, is conditionality. So if we have A arrow B, okay, Brandon has B, thus he has A. That's confusing necessary and sufficient. Or Brandon does not have A, thus he does not have B. This one is reversing the conditionality. This one is doing the negative, but the same direction. Those are invalid. They are called confusing necessary and sufficient conditions. So we'd have to have this going on in order for D to be correct. We don't have conditionality. There's no conditionality. So that allows you to eliminate D. If you picked it, it means that you don't understand the necessary sufficient well enough to know what this all is in the concept of conditionality. E relies on a source that's not well informed. This is like attacking the source, one of those appeals or ad hominem issues. We saw that in another one of these examples, but that's not what's happening here. It would be about where the research was from. If they said, I did research from Joe, my next door neighbor, and he says this, well, now E, it would be the correct answer. And it's like, who's Joe? I don't know who Joe is. How do we know he knows what he's talking about? And that's where E would have been correct. All right, moving forward. Section 3, we got a bunch more to do in this video. So vulnerable to criticism. So this one, the conclusion is that corporations use motivational posters is unlikely to achieve its purpose. Now, when you see achieve its purpose, you have to be able to tie that reference in where the purpose, this is that negative reference idea. So we got to know what they're doing it. The hope is, so that's their purpose, to boost their employees' motivation to work productively. And they're saying it's not going to happen. It's unlikely. It's unlikely to happen. And why do they say? Because almost all of them, so there's like your semi-strong degree, so it's on point with that, but they're saying they're already motivated. This is an absolute versus relative switch here. They're trying to say, since we are at an absolute non-comparative level, we are motivated. That means that we can't boost the motivation. You might be motivated, but can still kick it into that final gear. Hopefully you guys are motivated to do the LSAT. Hopefully my videos will make you that much more motivated. And that's what the idea of what we're trying to do here is. And we have to catch that mistake. So the correct answer is going to be E, where fails to consider that. Now, remember that triggers an overlooked option. So we want to accept the yellow and ask if it would weaken. So even if employees are already motivated, motivational posters may increase that motivation. That would be a huge problem for saying that they're not going to boost motivation. This directly attacks that conclusion, and so it makes it the correct answer. Okay, understanding fails to consider that it presents like weakened type language. Now, if we look at this, fails to consider whether corporations do not. So the question is, would this be something that would, whether or not, be weakening the argument? Whether corporations that do not use So I was really looking for the right explanation here. And the thing is, this is whether corporations, this is about the extended subject matter idea of this answer. It's a close answer. Okay. But this is about corporations that do not currently use motivation posters. Okay. When I went back to double check, they've begun decorating their halls with motivation posters, but they might have motivation posters elsewhere. We might be putting them around everybody's cubicle. In every single cubicle, we're putting a motivational poster. In every hallway, in the entrance, we have motivational posters. Now we're just adding it to the halls. Okay, so that's why A wouldn't actually apply to this situation. Close, because if they began using posters, it would increase it. That would be a problem. And so it really is just about that idea that we don't know these companies are, these corporations use some motivational posters. These corporations, we don't know that these corporations use motivational posters already or not. So close, but incorrect. Takes for granted that, remember, is necessary assumption. So we need to do the negation test. We're going to negate the yellow and see if that creates a problem. With respect to their employees' motivation to work productively, corporations that decorate halls with motivational posters are not representative. Okay, so this is getting into the I didn't even notice that language before. They're getting into the unrepresentative sample. Okay, that these corporations that decorate their hall are unrepresentative. But the evidence was about these corporations and the conclusion is about these corporations. So it's not an issue of representation of whether they're representative or not. So that's why B would be incorrect. C fails to consider that. Fails to consider that. So that's the weakened language. So if we accept that even if motivational posters do not have one particular, even if motivational posters do not have one particular beneficial effect, they may have similar effects. But the issue was this one beneficial effect. So what C is saying is, look, even if you're not going to boost their employees' motivation, maybe you're going to be able to boost productivity. Even if it doesn't boost their motivation to work productively, they will be more productive. That as an example, that's just one example. C is very generic. They may have similar effects that are equally beneficial. It could be any type, but the problem is the conclusion is all about the purpose, and the purpose was about boosting their motivation. So C would be bringing up other things outside the scope of just intended purpose. D, does not address adequately the possibility that. So fails to address adequately the possibility that. So the question is this something that they failed to address? So employees' productivity is strongly affected by factors. Let's see. Fails to employee productivity is strongly affected by factors. So this is focused. What I'm going to point out, this answer is focused on employee productivity and what affects it. Again, this was only about our motivation to work productively. So this actually makes it incorrect language. This is focused only on whether it's going to make them more productive when we only cared about increasing people's motivation to be productive. Technically different language. Okay. So that makes D incorrect and we can move on. Number 8, vulnerable to criticism. Now, correct. So the conclusion here is that it's the most effective. Most effective, the most effective. This is not like most, like semi-strong of over 50%. This is the most effective, which is a extreme relative. It means that it's more effective than any other softener. And the problem is the evidence is only comparing this. In the comparison, all we know about is they were given one towel washed with Fabric Soft versus one without it. So we're like, okay, yeah, so Fabric Soft versus no softener is good, but we don't know that we can't say that it's better than any other. So this has to do with how they're doing their comparison. They're comparing Fabric Soft to nothing as opposed to Fabric Soft versus all other fabric softeners, which is what the conclusion's about. So notice in this question, it says vulnerable criticism fails to consider whether. Remember, fails to consider, that language creates a weaken. So really this ends up being like a weaken question, but we have to add that whether. So it becomes more like a most useful. Whether is like that most useful either which way, would it weaken the argument? So if the consumers had the opportunity to test others versus not, whether or not. So if they had not had the opportunity, that would clearly weaken it. Because if they couldn't test it versus other ones, then how could we say it's better than the other ones? And so E clearly creates that hole in this argument. Now, if we look at A, any of the consumers tested are allergic. If they were allergic or not, would not weaken the question of their effectiveness. We already had evidence that they preferred it. Okay, so there is a jump here, a little bit of a jump that the ones they prefer is effective. There's also the unrepresentative sample potentially that 100 consumers are reflective. But here's what I'm going to say. Never just be, so many places say, once you see 100 consumers, you should be thinking about unrepresentative sample. I guess, but notice they don't go there all the time. A lot of times they don't. These are all other mistakes that they could have tested on, but this one doesn't go to that. This is just bringing up the allergies, and that's a different language than anything we cared about. Wouldn't be related to their effectiveness. Okay, so fabric is more or less harmful to the environment. Again, this is talking about their harmful environment. That's like allergies. It's another thing as to like maybe their preference, but we already know they prefer it. The question is, does preference hit most effective? Okay. And so that's not influencing the effectiveness. Okay. So fabric softener is much cheaper and more expensive than other. Expensive, another factor that might be back to preference, but not about effectiveness. So it's not bringing up anything about whether it is or is not the most effective. Okay, the consumers tested the find the benefits of using fabric softeners worth the expense. This is about expense again, so it's not about effective. Okay, so since there is this secondary mistake, I want to point out that I said that preference means effective, but A through D don't really hit on that. So if there was an answer related to it, it would have been correct. But instead, E is doing that bad comparison idea. So there were two mistakes. Notice the correct answer talks about that bad comparison. 18, vulnerable to criticism. Okay, so when we have vulnerable to criticism, that's the flaw question. So getting into this, the conclusion is it's widely accepted that it is sometimes morally right to obstruct the police in their work. Why? Because of these buildup, there's like, this is, if we are looking at the structure, there's a first line and then the subsidiary conclusion, thus this. So we'll say the first line is pink, thus they conclude orange, hence they conclude yellow. So the main conclusion is yellow, that it's morally right to obstruct police in their work. The morally right, we do have evidence about in both the pink and the orange. The orange says it's morally right for parents to hide the accused from police. Now, morally right to hide the accused from police, I think would be obstructing the police. So I do think that the orange proves the yellow. I actually think the orange proves the yellow. The problem is that orange is not a premise that we have to accept. It's a subsidiary conclusion. So the mistake in this argument is going to be in the connection between the pink and the orange. So the pink is saying that it's universally accepted that one has a moral duty to prevent members of one's family from being harmed. Now, there is a thing here. It's almost universally accepted. Okay. Now, it also comes back to this argument, the issue of one factor being conclusive. Even if you have a moral duty to protect, what happens when certain moral duties conflict? Which one wins out? Okay. Who's to say that we don't have other moral duties? You could have moral duties that conflict, and then you have to be able to resolve that. We don't have evidence about other moral duties, and we don't have any evidence about how we resolve it. And the correct answer is going to start highlighting that. So if we fails to consider the possibility that, even if you didn't fully pre-answer, remember, fails to consider the possibility that is weakened language. So if we're looking at this as a weaken and we accept that other moral principles would be widely recognized as overriding an obligation to protect a family member from harm, it says like, basically there's a possibility that there's other things that are going to get rid of that pink. And if you get rid of that pink, then you can't conclude orange. And if you can't conclude orange, then you can't conclude what that last line was, the main conclusion. So it would directly undermine this argument. So even if you didn't catch the mistake over here, you still have to recognize B is a weakened answer choice, and it would definitively weaken the argument. Okay. In A is saying it utilizes a single type for the purposes of justifying a broad. So they're going from a single to a broad. We have to ask, is that a jump? Okay. But the conclusion is not about a single. The problem here is not the single to justify the broad. Okay. Because the conclusion is about it's sometimes morally right. So if that one example would have been enough to validate that one, that broader moral right. So we do have to realize that there is this acceptability of using a single type to make a broad generalization of sometimes happening. That wouldn't be a flaw. That would be acceptable. So that's why A would be wrong. C says presumes without providing justification that creates a necessary assumption. So we're going to negate the yellow and see if that weakens the argument. So allowing the police to arrest an innocent person that, sorry, and I was not able to catch it. So instead of assisting, it would not assist. And instead of it not obstructing, it would obstruct. So they're saying allowing police to arrest an innocent person would not assist, but it would obstruct. That wouldn't, so if we accept that allowing police to arrest an innocent person, now here's what I'm going to focus on. Innocent person. How do we know they're innocent? Okay. I guess actually, sorry, I'm realizing now I'm tying a tie all together and move fast, and I see the time where I have a student at 12:30, so I got to be running. Shh, don't let them know that I'm running late from this. So person's parents to be falsely accused of a crime. So it's known by them. So that would be the innocent. Okay. And what they're saying is that that would not be obstructing the police in their work. Now, the problem is this. I actually said earlier, I said this second line, I was already accepting that it would prove the yellow. But the problem is the jump from the first line to the pink. That's the problem. This is trying to say that this wouldn't count. This would not be assisting and would not be obstructing. They're basically saying this wouldn't even be obstructing. Okay. So when they're like, but it's widely accepted to obstruct, saying, but it's not obstruction wouldn't actually weaken the argument of whether it is or is not okay to obstruct. We need something that would actually attack that right. And we said earlier, it was already established. So really the problem was that first line leading into the second line. And that's why B was correct and C is not. So takes for granted that. So takes for granted that is a necessary assumption question. So there is no moral obligation to obey the law. So the yellow would be that the negating it would be that there is sometimes a moral. So no is strong negative. You have to negate that to say there's sometimes moral obligation to obey the law. So if there's sometimes moral obligation to obey the law, would that weaken these arguments? And they're saying here, it's only sometimes okay to obstruct the law. If you want to say that's like not obeying, then there's sometimes moral obligation to obey would not be in conflict with saying sometimes there's not. So that's the problem with D. When you negate it, the degree ends up not hitting on the degree of the conclusion. So that's why D would be wrong. E takes for granted that that's creating the necessary assumption. So the parents mentioned in the example are mistaken. So if these parents are mistaken, what that's doing is going against more of a premise. And remember, that's not undermining argumentation. We don't want answers that go against a premise. They're saying, and what I'm saying by a premise, it's saying, if you do know. So it's already accepting the language is loaded. And this is why it never actually does go against a premise. It's conditioned, I should say, on knowing. So it's saying for a fact that you know. Okay. So if they were wrong, then this condition just wouldn't hold true. That doesn't weaken the condition. It doesn't weaken the if then. It's like, if Brandon wins the lottery, then he's going to buy a huge house. And it's like, but he's not going to win the lottery. That doesn't weaken the argument, right? If I said like, hey, if Joe gets a 180, then he's going to get into X law school, but so-and-so can't get a 180. Okay, but that doesn't prove me wrong that he would get in if he did. So that's the reason why E wouldn't actually weaken the argument. It's just saying we wouldn't have the condition we wouldn't be meeting the condition of a conditional idea. So it doesn't undermine the conditional idea. All right, 23. We have a flaw question here. So the conclusion is, reminding myself of this, clearly, then, these speeches are selfishly motivated and the promises made in them are unreliable. Now, I'm okay with this first half of saying the speech selfishly motivated. Notice a two-part conclusion. Why? Because their politician's purpose is in giving the speech is to get themselves elected. So where does the selfish come from? It's just to get themselves elected. I think that's selfish. Okay. If your purpose, if we accept that the purpose, remember, we have to accept the premise. So we accept that their purpose in giving speeches is to get themselves elected. That's a selfish motive. But where are they getting unreliable? This is that same ad hominem attack of a motive issue. They're focusing on their motives to say that it's unreliable. Okay. And that's where D is going to go against that. If overlooks the fact that, so we would have to accept the rest and see if it would weaken it. If a promise need not be unreliable just because the person who made it has a motive. That's saying that you could have a motive, but it's not unreliable. That's saying that you have the pink, but it's not going to be the conclusion of the unreliable. So that would weaken this argument definitively. A, the argument presumes without providing justification that, so necessary assumption. If a person's promise is not selfishly motivated, then that promise is reliable. Negating this always is negating an if then always deals with negating the then. There's a little more to it than that, but just for the sake of this one, it's going to negate. If we negate the then, you'd be talking about the promise being unreliable. The promise being unreliable would strengthen the argument. So when you do the negation of this, this would actually strengthen an argument. So you already can notice that it's going the wrong direction. The argument presumes without providing justification that says that it's assumption. Again, so I'm going to negate this. Promises made for selfish reasons are kept. If the promises never kept. This would say that they are sometimes kept. The negation of never kept would be that they are sometimes kept. would that go against a conclusion that they're unreliable? Now, if they had said the promises are definitively never going to happen, then we could say sometimes they're kept would be a problem. But unreliable allows for it to sometimes be kept. It's just saying that it's not always going to be kept. We don't know. It's just not 100%. We can't rely on them. So B wouldn't actually weaken because of that degree issue there. So argument confuses blank with blank, the effect with its cause. So we'd have to be able to point to, in order for that to be correct, you'd have to be able to point to a cause and say they switched it with an effect, or they'd have to point to, you'd have to be able to point to the effect and say they switched it with the cause. I just don't see necessarily here the cause and effect. I see intent. I just don't see anything actually about cause and effect, what actually is going to happen. We'd have to have information about what actually would happen. E, overlooks the fact that, so this would be introducing weakened language, the overlooked options. So a candidate who makes a promises for selfish reasons may nonetheless be worthy of office. So this is about whether they are worthy for office, but that doesn't tell me about the reliability of their promises. Okay, even if they were lying, it still makes them worthy, and that's going to be the problem with that one. So we got one more question here. Vulnerable to criticism. Okay, vulnerable to criticism. So when we have vulnerable to criticism, the conclusion here is that the anthropologist's claim is false. We have to go, there's that negative reference. We've discussed this before. We got to go to what that reference is. They argue that. So really, I'm not even concerned with that. I want to know, what are they arguing, and then negate it. So they're saying the human species could not have survived prehistoric times if the species had not evolved. So negating this, okay, if the claim is false, negating an if then, and this is where I guess I'll get into it. Negating the if then is accepting the if, but not the then. So that the species evolved, but they did survive. So the conclusion of this, when you do it right and you see what the claim is, the conclusion is saying that it's possible that you could not evolve, but survive. You have to negate the then, which is the yellow. Okay. So it's that they would not evolve, but survive. The problem is their evidence focused on somebody who did evolve, but did not survive. This is going to relate to this issue here. Okay. They're doing inverse converse. This first conditional, if we read it, and you could have caught it while you were reading, if orange, if you were not evolving, then you did not survive. Okay. So if we were writing it, it would be not evolve, then not survive. Okay. And what they're saying is that there's evidence of these things that did evolve. Okay. That they thrived in a diverse, so I'm sorry, they, I'm saying evolve. I've been saying evolve. It's having the ability to cope. I was going off memory, to cope. So the ability to thrive means survive. If you did not thrive, so it's not evolve. If you do not thrive, then you will not survive. And what they're saying is, hey, but they did thrive. They thrived here. These groups thrived. As soon as you see, it's like Brandon thrived. It's not the Brandon, it's those A's thrived. So A's thrived. If the A's thrive, that's the opposite of the if. As soon as you get the opposite of the if, that's negating following the same pattern. That's already irrelevant. So that was my example earlier when I said, if somebody gets a 180, then they will get into X law school. And it's like, but they don't get a 180. That's irrelevant. It doesn't mean anything to that conditional. So what's happening is, as I talked about it when I highlighted this, confusing necessary and sufficient conditions, which is what answer choice A is saying. Now, if we go to the other answer choice, and that's where the other condition being required with being sufficient. So they're talking about the switch from necessary and sufficient. Okay, if we're thinking of it more conceptually, the idea is they're saying thriving was necessary for the survival. Okay, but they thrived, but they didn't survive, so you must be lying. So thriving wasn't sufficient is what it highlights. It highlights that thriving wasn't enough to help them survive. They went extinct anyway. So they're saying thriving was not sufficient. So that highlights that you're wrong about saying thriving is necessary. So they're confusing that necessary and sufficient condition. Now, takes for granted that is that necessary assumption language. So negating this, okay? Negating this, we would negate the then. At least one of the related extinct species must have had the same. So none of the extinct species had the same characteristics. Whether we had extinct species having the same characteristics or not is not relevant, because we already had an example of something that did go extinct, had those same characteristics. So if there's other related ones, whether there is at least one other related one, is not relevant here. Okay, generalizes. So they're getting into from the fact that all related. So they're generalizing from one to all. So they're doing that jump from one to all. They're not going from one to all. If you have, they're trying to undermine a strong all statement. The evidence is about all, and they're trying to say that's false because of this one example. Well, one example would prove it false if it was done conditionally correct. If you get a 180, then you get into X law school, and you even tell me one person that got a 180 but didn't get into X law school, that would prove it wrong. So it's not going to be C. Fails to consider the possibility that this is going to be the overlooked option. Okay, so A's had one or more characteristic that, so overlooked option is the weaken. So if they had one or more characteristic that lessened their chances, this is explaining why they didn't survive. Okay, this is getting into the reasons why, but we know for a fact they were extinct. The question was, is that enough to dismantle the conditional reasoning of the anthropologist? And so their purpose behind, like the explanation for why they didn't survive is not relevant. E, fails to consider the possibility that, so this would be getting into the overlooked option again, a weaken. So even if a condition caused a result to occur, it was not necessary. This is actually going to be a very tough trap answer, okay? Because what it's saying is, even if something did cause, it's not necessary. We were dealing with, even if something doesn't cause, then it could still be necessary. So this is actually the difference. So I'm going to highlight here. If we had this argument, okay, this answer choice, okay, this answer is equal to treating a necessary as if it were sufficient, where this one is treating a sufficient as if it were necessary. Okay, remember, sufficient is the if, the necessary is the then, and we have to be able to recognize the difference. I'll tell you, they rarely test on that difference, but they did here. This is saying that the condition was in fact sufficient, but it was not necessary, when their argument needs to recognize that even if something's not sufficient, it could be necessary. So that's flipped. Very tricky trap answer. Anyway, that's going to be the flaws breakdown. Hopefully that helps you along the way, but recognize these are tough questions. So keep working at them and you'll get better. Stay tuned for more explanations.